Welcome to the True Crime Family channel. Today we'll be delving into a chilling case set in the quiet town Willow Creek in mid-2208. Our story involves a seemingly normal housewife, a priest who is seduced by a crazy woman, and a twisted plot for murder. July 4th, 2008. Willow Creek synopsis, Georgia. The air is thick with tension as the police receive an anonymous tip about a body found deep in the woods. The discovery will lead to a shocking investigation that unravels a sinister tale of seduction, deceit, and murder that will shake this small-town Twittscore. Father Michael Bennett had always Father Michael Bennett been the bedrock of Willow Creek. With his calm demeanor and deep, resonant voice, he brought comfort to the town's congregation every Sunday in his late 30s. Michael had dedicated nearly a decade of his life to the church, becoming more than just a priest, but was a counselor, a confidant, and a beacon of moral guidance for the entire community. People respected him not just for his unwavering faith, but for his genuine compassion. He knew everyone by name, remembered their stories, and not always seemed to have the right words to soothe troubled souls. Elizabeth Harper was one of those. Elizabeth Harper troubled souls, though she hid it well behind her flawless exterior. She was the epitome of a perfect Southern housewife, beautiful, devout, and always impeccably dressed, married to James Harper, a festering wound successful local businessman. Elizabeth's life seemed to be the picture of contentment, but beneath the surface there was a growing bitterness, a festering wound that only she knew about. James, despite his keenness and dedication, was infertile. They had tried for years to conceive, consulting doctors and praying fervently, but nothing worked. The whispers of hope that once filled their home had long since faded, leaving a void that Elizabeth couldn't ignore to the outside world. Her faith-twisted marriage appeared idyllic, but Elizabeth began to see it differently. She couldn't understand why God would deny her the one thing she wanted most. Slowly her faith twisted into something darker. She began to see James' infertility as a cursey sign that perhaps he was tainted, perhaps even possessed by something evil. These thoughts, noted ever growing louder with each passing day. Her obsession with having a child became all-consuming, transforming her once devout prayers into desperate pleas for divine intervention. Elizabeth's visits to the church became irregular occurrences of frequent that it hardly went unnoticed by the other parishioners. Yet none suspected anything unusual. After all, she was a devoted wife in a troubled marriage, seeking solace and guidance from Father Bennett. At first, their confessions were typical prayers for strength, mentions of her struggles with her husband's infertility and the growing sense of hopelessness she felt. But as weeks passed, her confessions grew darker. Elizabeth began to speak of the devil, of a curse she believed had been placed upon James. She told Father Bennett that she feared the devil's influence. The reason they could not have a child. Father Bennett listened with increasing concern, his heart heavy with the weight of Elizabeth's suffering. He offered prayers, spoke of God's love, and reminded her that the Lord works in mysterious ways. But Elizabeth was persistent. Each time she came to confession, she would return to the idea of a curse, of the devil's hand in her life. Slowly she began to manipulate the conversation, planting seeds of doubt and fear. In Bennett's mind, she played on his sense of duty, telling him that only someone as close to God as she could help her. She began to suggest that perhaps God had a different plan for her, one that involved the priest himself. Elizabeth spoke of divine intervention, of how maybe God had brought to Father Bennett for areas, and she implied that perhaps God wanted him to help her conceive a child, one that would be free from the devil's curse. The more she spoke, the more she blurred the line between faith and her twisted desires. Father Bennett, torn between his torn vows and his growing concern for Elizabeth, struggled to resist their words, but Elizabeth was relentless, and over time she wore him down. One evening, after yet another emotional confession, Elizabeth asked Father Bennett to come to her home. She said she needed spiritual guidance, that she was at her breaking point and didn't know where else to turn. Reluctantly, Father Bennett agreed, believing he could provide the comfort she sought. When he arrived, the house was dimly lit, and Elizabeth greeted him at the door, her eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and something else, something he couldn't quite place. As they sat in the quiet of her living room, Elizabeth spoke softly, her voice laced with emotion. She told him how lost she felt, how the devil was winning, and how she feared there was no hope left for her. And her husband, she looked into Bennett's eyes, pleading with him to save her. She moved closer, her hand gently resting on his arm, her touch lingering longer than its would father. Bennett tried to pull away to remind her that this was not appropriate, but Elizabeth's touch, her closeness, and the way she spoke of God's will confused him. She told him that God had chosen him, that he was meant to help her in this way to bring forth a child that would be pure and blessed. Her words were intoxicating, twisting the very faith. Bennett felt dear in that moment, surrounded by the dim light, and Elizabeth's pleading gaze. Father Bennett's resistance faltered. Elizabeth leaned in, her lips brushing against this, and he gave in. The encounter quickly escalated. Driven by Elizabeth's calculated seduction and Bennett's weakening resolve, they moved to the bedroom where the act was carried out, each moment pushing Father Bennett further away from the man he had been. What Bennett didn't, Elizabeth's plank know, was that Elizabeth had planned this all along. Her intention wasn't just to seduce him. It was to conceive a child, a child she believed would be a gift from God, free from the curses. She was convinced James carried, the priest caught in the throes of his own moral collapse, was unaware of Elizabeth's true motives to him. It was a moment of weakness, a gravesin he would carry with him forever. To Elizabeth, it was the fulfillment of a twisted plan, one that would soon spiral into something far darker. A few weeks after that fateful night with Father Bennett, Elizabeth began to notice subtle changes in her body: fatigue, nausea, a heightened sense of smell. At first she dismissed them, attributing her symptoms to stress or perhaps even wishful thinking, but as the days passed and her period didn't come, he finally allowed herself to consider the possibility. She purchased a pregnancy test and took it in the early morning hours while James was still asleep. When the test confirmed it, he was overcome with emotion. Elizabeth clutched the positive result to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she whispered prayers of gratitude to her. This was an ordinary pregnancy. It was a divine gift, a child blessed by God. Just as she had hoped in that moment, she was certain that all the suffering, all the confusion had led to this one miraculous event. Their faith was reaffirmed, and she was filled with a renewed sense of purpose. But as days turned into weeks, the voices that had once offered comfort and guidance began to change. They became more insistent, more demanding, whispering dark thoughts into her mind. They told her that James was a danger to the child, that his very presence was a threat. The voices convinced her that James was possessed by the devil, and that the only way to protect their unborn child was to remove him from their lives entirely. Elizabeth's mental state began to deteriorate rapidly. She withdrew from the world, spending most of her time in solitude, consumed by the voices in her. They were relentless, filling her mind with visions of James as a malevolent force, a threat that needed to be eliminated. She stopped praying for James' soul and started praying for the strength to do what she now believed was God's will. The idea of murdering her husband terrified her, but the voices reassured her, telling her that it was a righteous act. They said that by killing James, she would be protecting her child from the devil's influence, ensuring that the baby would be born pure and holy. The more she listened, the more convinced she became that this was the only way. The plan began to form in her mind, taking shape in the quiet hours of the night, as the voices guided her every thought. On the night of July 3rd, Elizabeth finally carried out her plan. She had prepared James's favorite meal, ensuring that it was perfect in every way. As they sat down to dinner, she watched him closely, waiting for the right moment. When his back was turned, she slipped a powerful sedative into his drink, stirring it in with practiced ease. James, unaware of the danger, drank it down, smiling at his wife as she praised her cooking. It didn't take long for the drug to take effect. James' eyelids grew heavy, and his speech began to slur. She struggled to stay awake. Elizabeth remained calm, her face a mask of concern as she held him to bed, telling him that he must be exhausted as soon as she was unconscious. Elizabeth moved with purpose. She retrieved a knife from the kitchen and returned to the bedroom, the voices surging her on, telling her that this was the moment of truth. She hesitated for only a second, but the voices grew louder, pushing her to act. They filled her mind with images of her unborn child, vulnerable and at risk, and told her that only by spilling James's blood could she protect the baby. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she raised the knife, but her resolve didn't waver. With a final prayer, she brought the blade down, stabbing James repeatedly. Each thrust of the knife was accompanied by the voice's praise, telling her that she was doing the right thing. When it was over, Elizabeth stood over her husband's lifeless body, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was eerily silent. Now the voices no longer speaking, as if satisfied with what she had done. Elizabeth looked down at the blood-stained sheets, her mind numbed as she tried to comprehend the enormity of her actions, but before she could allow herself to feel any guilt, her sorrow, the voices returned, softer now, soothing her with promises that she had done well, that she had saved her child, leaving the body where it lay. Elizabeth went to clean herself up, her mind already shifting to the next steps. She knew she would need to dispose of the body to cover her tracks, but for now all she felt was relief. The danger was gone. The voices assured her and her child was safe. As she lay down to sleep that night, Elizabeth clutched her belly, whispering a lullaby, unborn baby within, convinced that she had fulfilled her divine purpose. A few weeks after that night, Father Bennett began to notice something that made his heart sink during Mass. He couldn't help but observe Elizabeth's growing belly, the way she moved the slight swell of her abdomen. It was unmistakable. A cold dread settled in his chest as memories of their encounter flooded back. Could it be possible that the child she carried washes? The thought alone was enough to make him feel sick with guilt. His concern deepened when he realized that James Harper, Elizabeth's husband, had been seen in town for days, usually a familiar face around Willow Creek. James's absence was noticed by more than just Father. Whispers began to circulate, but none seemed to know where he had gone. The priest's mind raced with possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. Unable to bear the weight of his suspicions any longer, Bennett decided to confront Elizabeth after Mason Sunday. He approached her quietly, pulling her aside with a strained voice, hesked about James, trying to mask the fear that had been gnawing at him. Elizabeth met his gaze with a calm smile. Here, yes, betraying nothing, she told him that James was away on business, that he'd be back soon, and that there was nothing to worry about. But Father Bennett couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Elizabeth's reassurance did little to ease his mind. In fact, it only made his unease grow. The way she spoke, the way she dismissed his concerns so easily, left him feeling cold. He knew her well enough to sense that she was shitting something. The guilt and fear began to eat away at him, and he found himself pulling away from her, avoiding her every opportunity. The woman he had once felt such sympathy for now filled him with dread. Then on July 4, 2008, everything investigation changed. The local police received an anonymous tip about a body found in the woods just outside town. The officers responded quickly, and what they discovered made the whole of Willow Creek tremble in fear. James Harper's mutilated body lay hidden among the trees, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the ground and traces of a bizarre ritual. The town, usually quiet and peaceful, was thrown into chaos. Rumors spread like wildfire as people tried to make sense of the horrific crime. The police wasted no time launching an investigation. They began piecing together the events leading up to James's murder, interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something. It wasn't long before suspicion began to fall on Elizabeth. The detectives found inconsistencies in her story, small details that didn't add up. She claimed James had been away on business, yet there were no records of any recent trips. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the Harper house in the days leading up to his disappearance. As the investigation progressed, Father Bennett's guilt became unbearing, terrible. He had tried to stay away to keep his distance, but he couldn't ignore the growing sense of responsibility. He felt they knew something that the police didn't, something that could change everything. With a heavy heart, had decided to come forward. He went to the station and confessed to the affair, revealing his fear that the child Elizabeth was carrying might be his. It was a difficult decision, but he couldn't keep the secret any longer. The detectives took his confession seriously, and it only intensified their investigation into Elizabeth. They began to piece together a timeline of events, uncovering her frequent visits to the church and her increasingly erratic behavior. Witnesses reported seeing her act strangely in the weeks before James's death, talking to herself, wandering the streets at odd hours. Forensic evidence started to up, tying Elizabeth to the murder scene. Her fingerprints were found on the knife, and traces of James's blood were discovered in their home. As the evidence mounted, Elizabeth's facade began to crack. The voices in her head, once her guides, now turned against her, demanding more and more from her. She became increasingly unhinged, her mind slipping further into madness. The police, armed with the truth, moved into to arrest. They're bringing an end to the horror that had gripped Willow Creek. On August 8, 2008, the quiet town of Willow Creek was shocked. Kenanchi again as the police arrived at Elizabeth Harper's home to arrest her. By this time, her pregnancy was unmistakably visible, her belly round with the child she believed was divinely conceived. The officers moved quickly, securing the house and leading Elizabeth out in handcuffs. She offered no resistance, her expression eerily calm as she was escorted to the waiting police car inside the home. Investigators uncovered chilling evidence that linked her directly to the murder of James Harper. Among the items they found were remnants of the strange ritual she had performed in the woods, the same symbols etched into the dirt, scrawled on papers hidden in her bedroom. They also discovered personal belongings of James tucked away in a box under her bed, including his watch and wedding ring. With this damning evidence, Elizabeth was officially charged with first-degree murder. The news of her arrest spread quickly through Willow Creek, leaving the community in shock. Elizabeth, who had once been seen as a devoted wife and a pillar of the church, was now the prime suspect in a gruesome murder. Father Bennett, who had distanced himself after his confession, found himself in a state of deep despair. The realization that his actions had played a part in the tragedy was more than he could bear. He struggled with the knowledge that his lapse in judgment had set off a chain of events that led to a man's death. A summer turned to fall. Preparations for the trial began on October 10, 2008. The trial courtroom was packed with spectators eager to see the woman who had been dubbed the Devil's Wife by the media. The trial was the talk of the town, with every detail dissected and analyzed by those following the case. The prosecution laid out their case with meticulous precision, painting Elizabeth as a manipulative woman who had lured Father Bennett into her web to achieve her own twisted goals. They argued that the voices she claimed to hear were nothing more than a convenient excuse to justify Her Highness' actions. Elizabeth's defense team, however, took a different approach. They had attempted to plead insanity, citing her delusions and the voices she said had driven her to kill. They presented medical experts who testified that Elizabeth had a history of mental illness, suggesting that she was not in control of her actions when she committed the crime. They described her as a deeply troubled woman who had been pushed over the edge by her inability to have children and her belief that she was carrying a divine child. The turning point in the trial came when Father Bennett was called to the stand as a key witness. The courtroom fell silent as she took his place, the weight of his guilt visible in his downcast eyes. His testimony was crucial, and everyone knew it. Bennett recounted the events leading up to the murder, detailing how Elizabeth had seduced him. They found were remnants of the strange ritual she had performed in the woods, the same symbols etched into the dirt, scrawled on papers hidden in her bedroom. They also discovered personal belongings of James tucked away in a box under her bed, including his watch and wedding ring. With this damning evidence, Elizabeth was officially charged with first-degree murder. The news of her arrest spread quickly through Willow Creek, leaving the community in shock. Elizabeth, who had once been seen as a devoted wife and a pillar of the church, was now the prime suspect in a gruesome murder. Father Bennett, who had distanced himself after his confession, found himself in a state of deep despair. The realization that his actions had played a part in the tragedy was more than he could bear. He struggled with the knowledge that his lapse in judgment had set off a chain of events that led to a man's death. A summer turned to fall. Preparations for the trial began on October 10, 2008. The trial courtroom was packed with spectators eager to see the woman who had been dubbed the Devil's Wife by the media. The trial was the talk of the town, with every detail dissected and analyzed by those following the case. The prosecution laid out their case with meticulous precision, painting Elizabeth as a manipulative woman who had lured Father Bennett into her web to achieve her own twisted goals. They argued that the voices she claimed to hear were nothing more than a convenient excuse to justify Her Highness' actions. Elizabeth's defense team, however, took a different approach. They had attempted to plead insanity, citing her delusions and the voices she said had driven her to kill. They presented medical experts who testified that Elizabeth had a history of mental illness, suggesting that she was not in control of her actions when she committed the crime. They described her as a deeply troubled woman who had been pushed over the edge by her inability to have children and her belief that she was carrying a divine child. The turning point in the trial came when Father Bennett was called to the stand as a key witness. The courtroom fell silent as she took his place, The weight of his guilt visible in his downcast eyes, his testimony was crucial, and everyone knew it then. Net recounted the events leading up to the murder, detailing how Elizabeth had seduced him, and how he had been manipulated into believing that he was fulfilling God's will. He spoke of the overwhelming guilt that had led him to confess his sins to the police, hoping to prevent further tragedy. His words left a lasting impact on the jury. They saw in him a man who had been deeply flawed, yet ultimately remorseful. The prosecution used his testimony to reinforce their argument that Elizabeth had planned the murder with cold calculation, using her influence over the priest to achieve her goals. The defense, however, argued that Bennett's testimony only proved how unhinged Elizabeth had become, driven mad by her delusions. As the trial dragged on, the townspeople of Willow Creek were torn between horror and disbelief. The details that emerged in court were shocking: ritualistic killings, twisted religious beliefs, and the downfall of a once respected priest. The case had all the elements of a dark tale that would be whispered about for years to come. Finally, on Aftermath, November 15, 2008, the jury returned with their verdict. Elizabeth Harper was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her fate sealed by the overwhelming evidence against her. There would be no redemption for Elizabeth, no chance at freedom. In the aftermath of the trial, Father Bennett resigned from the priesthood, unable to continue in his role after the shame and guilt he had experienced. He left Willow Creek seeking solace and solitude, but the weight of his actions followed him wherever he went. The town, once a peaceful place, was left scarred by the events, with the story of Elizabeth Harper becoming a dark legend. A cautionary tale told in hushed nests. The people of Willow Creek would never forget the tragedy that unfolded in their midst, and the memory of the devil's wife would linger like a shadow over the town for years to come. After the trial ended and the courtroom emptied, one final issue remained. The child born while she was in prison needed a future. His cries echoed through the cold gray walls, a small voice in a world of chaos. As soon as she was born, Child Protective Services took the boy into their care. A social worker with tired eyes and agent-let touch held him close, knowing his life would be different. This was an ordinary case, a child brought into the world under the shadow of crime and scandal. The process was quick, almost as if everyone knew this would happen. The boy wouldn't go home with the mother, who was now a prisoner. Instead, a foster family was chosen to give him a new life far from the troubles that marked his birth. As the car drove away from the prison, the baby slept peacefully, unaware of the past that he had just left behind. Someone Quana family was getting ready to welcome a new member. They hoped to give him a fresh start, far from the truth of where he came from. But the past doesn't always stay buried, and one day those old secrets might come back to the surface as the dust settles in Willow Creek. The story of Elizabeth Harper and Father Bennett leaves us with more questions than answers. Beth truly driven mad by her obsession to bear a child, or were the voices she claimed to hear really a convenient excuse for her actions? Could Father Bennett have prevented this tragedy if he had not succumbed to his own weaknesses? Some in the town whisper that Elizabeth may have been a victim of her own delusions, while others believes he was far more calculating than anyone ever realized. And what of Father Bennett, on-sea man of faith, now a broken shell of what he once was? Could he have found redemption if he had resisted temptation, or was his downfall inevitable consequence of the very faith he sought to uphold? If you're as captivated by tales of twisted obsession and dark secrets as we're, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We have countless true crime stories that delve into the depths of human nature, where obsession becomes the ultimate undoing. Don't miss out on these gripping tales, because sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. English auto-generated, all from the True Crime family. Crime scenes, mysteries, related for you. Recently uploaded, watched,